Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight, for braving the heat. I'm Ksenia Gerstein. I'm the curator of modern and contemporary art. Is that better? Okay. Can I raise it momentarily, or should I? Okay, I'll squat. Okay. I don't want to disturb the mic as you have it set. Okay. So this is our public event accompanying the exhibition that we're in, Susan Copich, Staged Stories. And for the presentation in our midst tonight, we have Susan Copich, the artist who created these really wonderful, thought-provoking, incisive, and in some cases, very funny works. I'll just say a little bit about Susan. She received her BFA in dance performance and choreography from The Ohio State University and had a whole, I'm just going to erase this. Okay. Okay. And had a career as a dancer and Pilates studio owner before shifting her attention to photography and acting. She studied at the Terry Schreiber School of Acting and at the International Center for Photography, both in New York City, and began exhibiting her work in 2012 with Domestic Bliss, which is the earliest series in this exhibition, first being shown in 2014. So since then, for about the last 10 years, Susan has continued to exhibit extensively in galleries, independent art spaces, at art fairs, and in juried exhibitions, and has received a lot of coverage in art publications and on social media, where the response to her work apparently has been really intense. And if any of you, particularly aspiring artists, are curious about that, ask about it in the Q&A. I sort of got hints today through conversation that there's some really interesting stories there. The show at the Ulrich is her first solo museum exhibition, and as the curator of this project, I've been really struck by how intense people, and also wide-ranging people's reactions to this show have been. And my sense is that, especially from talking to women visitors, that when the work strikes a chord, it really strikes a chord with people. So tonight, Susan will share with us a selection of images. I think most of them are here on view as well, and discuss her intentions and her process, delving into the technical, metaphorical, and psychological layers that make up her work. Before I pass the podium to her, as always, I really want to thank the people who make our work possible. They include members of the Ulrich Friends with Benefits group, whose continuing support of the museum makes our exhibitions and programs possible, and WSU and the City of Wichita, who provide really invaluable ongoing operational support. And with that, I'll stop talking and pass the podium to Susan.
Okay, real quick, for social media purposes, it's awesome. Okay. First off, hello. Thank you so much for coming out. I want to thank Ulrich Museum for hosting Staged Stories and the full team for coming together and making this event and exhibit possible. I'm especially grateful for the collaboration with Ksenia, whose contribution has been nothing short of ideal. And the installation, expertly handled by James, has added a sublime touch to the exhibition. And I must note, as it is still very important, the museum's decision to showcase a female artist with a solo show is truly commendable, considering the still underrepresentation that persists in the art world. So, thank you. And for all of those wondering, I'd like to start with a little disclaimer. No harm was caused to any humans or animals in the creation of this artwork, physically or psychologically, or otherwise. So I began Domestic Bliss when I was busy parenting two young daughters and finding it a challenge to juggle the on-call lifestyle of an auditioning actor and a scheduled dependency of child rearing, as well as the early feelings of irrelevancy that plague the then newly minted middle-aged. I had been also dabbling in some photography classes for several years in New York City at ICP. And so this was the setting of the stage, this was the setting of the stage, so to speak, for Domestic Bliss. Let's start by talking about perspective, the lens in which we see the world. Read a book, tell a story, how our unique, well-crafted optics, how we craft them, whether they're conscious or not, influence every aspect of our lives. For me, it influences how I meditate on life and what is drawn out of the fray. We carry these points of view wherever we go. We also collide with creators who carefully construct the lens in which their art should be viewed. When this happens, we can either go on the journey with them or feel manipulated. Now, I do not want to try to tell you how to respond to my work, but rather to reveal some of my insights upon them through a couple perspectives I choose to highlight. Also, how I crafted them and what I was thinking in the construction of them. This, for me, is especially true for domestic bliss, as I've heard them be referred to as trite or obvious. And I can sort of agree with that because they have that component, but only upon first glance. But before I go there, I want to draw attention to something. You may have noticed that my work is drenched with hyper-feminine clothing and stylization. I use this tool to turn up the volume of stereotypical female that we hold culturally in our mind's eye: dresses, makeup, hair, which simultaneously includes our collective conscious the quality of passive, naive, flirtatious, nurturing, accepting. These women in domestic bliss are lightly sprinkled with these characteristics and more heavily layered with aggressive and non-apologetic characteristics. Perhaps it was my own need to reclaim the feminine stereotypes I grew up with and to secretly live vicariously through these characters. And I know it was my desire to drive home new optics on what it is to be feminine. This conversation is changing in real time, but back in 2010, we were still mired in these mediated femininities constructed by advertisements, movies, television, and hence the air we breathe. And what I find endlessly fascinating is how the narrative changes before our eyes. When I was young, to be a feminist was good. And to my young self, it felt finite, like we'd arrived. But as time marched on, that clarity slipped through my fingertips. That laser perspective became unfocused and blurry through all sorts of outer forces. So because I have time on my side now and perspective, history reminds me that the constructive conversation and visuals need to continue to push the progress forward. The work is never done, kind of like domestic chores. So domestic bliss. So coming back to the trite and obvious that I talked about earlier. In domestic bliss, I rummage around the sinister side of domesticity, the monotony, the grinding servitude it's cloaked in, while simultaneously dressing it up with ripped from the pages of magazine pop and glamour, giving it an accessibility, an invitation for all to consume. I consciously crafted the central figure, the woman, the archetypal mother figure, a three-dimensional experience expressed through the project, rather than a flat, repetitive, single-dimensional existence. I examine the female figure from multiple sides to challenge the dangerous ideology of perfection and reveal and revel in the dynamic qualities of good to bad, beautiful to ugly, nurturing to selfish, or loving to violent. It encourages a complete expression and a shedding of the myth of perfection. What I've realized through creating, talking about, handling, and living with my work now, there runs a through line, and that through line is violence. Each project expressing it differently. And I didn't intentionally begin domestic bliss wanting to explore violence. Rather, I see it as the water we drank for a long time and currently drink. It's part of our culture, our subconscious, hence my expression. As a young person coming of age, I attached myself to some very powerful films that revealed female characters with a dark side, like A Woman Under the Influence by John Cassavetes, and Chantal Ackerman's Jean Dielman, and Blue Velvet by David Lynch, just to name a few. You can see the influence of these films throughout my work on many levels. So with this overarching lens of violence, let's look at several pieces from Domestic Bliss. Oh, and one more thought. As I unpack my selection of images, keep in mind that the information is cumulative and that often the tools I will speak about will exist in multiple, if not all, images. So, a perfect example of this violence is bath time. So for some, you may just see the realism of the violent overtures in this image. And it's intentional, drawing out those dark undertones of violent thoughts and violent narratives that mothers and women can certainly be in conversation with into the forefront of this image. Now, with this being said, there are also visual symbols to hint towards complexities of life and nuances of emotion. So within this image, both nurturer and annihilator coexist. It is expressed through the tender yet firm grasp of the daughter's shoulder by the mother figure, the questioning, almost pleading look in the mother's eyes, as well as the look of guilt, the thematic color choice of white, signifying purity and innocence, which is in direct conflict with the image's more obvious messaging, as well as the dramatic stage lighting all around the bathtub as an indicator towards theater or fantasy. There is duality presented in this image, representing complexity in the female character. Another example is anger management. A strong show of violence encapsulates this image, with the mother figure twisting the adored puppy of the two daughters. They are dressed to perfection and seem to be two dolls in her perfect reality play, living some nightmare of their own. The sheer image of a woman, especially of a certain class, snapping and killing a family pet is nothing short of shocking. It introduces thoughts that the female of the household is crumbling to the pressures of her surroundings and cultural expectations, to rain down violence on the smallest, most innocent member of the family. It is juxtaposed with heightened femininity, perfect makeup, perfectly done hair, and well-matched dresses, but distorted by the lens width and camera placement to exaggerate both the grotesque as well as the comical. So, in addition to costuming, acting, and prop placement, I utilize various technical aspects of photography to enhance the narrative of my work, particularly through the use of dark comedy. I believe that injecting moments of laughter within the exploration of challenging subject matters is crucial. By carefully crafting the comedic elements, I strive to create a compelling and engaging experience that challenges perspectives and elicits both introspection and laughter. Hang on, I need a sip of water. All American certainly expresses potential or realized violence. By placing the gun within the context of the most iconic of all domestic chores, pie baking, very a la Americana, I elevate the tension of opposites. The opposites being a traditional, wholesome activity of American culture, framed with a gun in the foreground, which can symbolize a threat. Let's look at it as an antithesis to each other, which would add discord within a single frame. Throughout Domestic Bliss, I use the tension of opposites as a tool. I also supplanted let's call it a visual epiphany or a subliminal messaging, which would be gun culture is as American as apple pie. Here are references to cultural opposites and clashes as well, but only depending on your perspective. This image is an excellent example of the ultra-femininities I referred to earlier, not just in all the ways I've already mentioned, but her pose as well, which harkens back to the classic pinup girl. So jumping back to domesticity and its inherent violence, a real-life example of this tragedy is the life story of Sylvia Plath. She seemed to be in constant conflict of her role as mother and wife mother and artist, lover and mother. Her need to express her angst and alienation within these defined roles through her powerful words, and to this day, in my opinion, have never been so eloquently and dynamically expressed. They are viscerally experienced. I loosely pay tribute to Sylvia Plath in 3 of my images from my mini-series within Domestic Bliss. Film Noir 1, Film Noir 2, and most directly, Film Noir 3, Coffee Break. I find a kindred spirit in this female artist's expression of anger and the pushing against culturally perceived limitations. So within this project, another of my goals was to not have the same outcome for each image. I wanted each character to express different power struggles and status plays within the family structure. I was looking to represent the intricacies of life through the series as a whole. I have different characters within different images show their own fluidity of status, replicating real life and basically just good contemporary storytelling. A couple of examples of this is Spare the Rod. It's probably the most blatant. Here I wanted the children to overpower the parental stronghold after establishing that the mother ruled the roost with her dark thoughts and complexities. So if you're wondering about the title and some of the other titles I use, they are directly named after idioms and axioms. This was an early mechanism I used from the very first image I created in Domestic Bliss. Spilt milk. I chose the idiom, "Don't cry over spilt milk," that I wanted to explore along with the base emotions of this idiom, repression and sadness, and then constructed an image around these feelings of helplessness. So each image in Domestic Bliss, which is all behind you, is born from an axiom and then constructed from there. So now going back to the idea of shifting powers and status, let go. I leave it up to the viewers as to who let go. Is it the daughter or the mother? But whatever it is, each is a differing outcome, one wrought with guilt, the other with deceit. Another good example of this flipped power dynamic is Mother's Day. The image is celebrating the sheer rebellion of the girls on a very culturally significant day. I specifically give the power to the youngest member with symbols of death and life in the forefront of the image as the eldest child looks upon as witness. But even as I highlight the violence inherent in each image across the board, the image contains humor to lighten the load, even if it's just the absurdity of the action. And continuing the pursuit of increased tension, the tightened, taut slingshot adds to this dynamic. Let's unpack the image toy. This is an excellent example of taking a cultural, political, social issue and meditating on it within Domestic Bliss. Gun control, right? Children with guns. We see this played out on our headlines daily. Parents who are distracted with, well, here, the torso, the six-pack, which could represent any number of adult distractions. Addiction, work, life, our smartphones. Here, the mother holds the power or attention. Or does she? If you look a little longer, the tension is that the children are absolutely holding the power with what is in their hands. And then the titling flirting with the idea of what is the toy? Is it the boy toy in the foreground or the gun in the young girl's hand? This only increases the complexity within the frame. It creates questions, which in turn makes us question reality and truth and perception. So I've not spoken about the lover character or the husband character yet. But I'll quickly touch upon the husband character, or the suit, as I playfully refer to him as. As I started to work with him, I used him as an object to set up his first storyline or character trait, as you can see him in Old Habits. But as he developed, he became almost an omnipresent, foreboding character in Sugar Rush. and flexes his security and ambivalence in Monday morning. And what can be seen as servitude or enabling in Mommy's Little Helpers. He's changing and developing in each frame. He appears to allow for his character to be full. I'm doing this so that his character can be full and complex, even while headless. In the later created whatever, he has the last laugh. I believe the strength of domestic bliss is that on first view, it all seems so obvious and blatant, and this was intentional, like candy or magazine adverts, or how American culture can appear at first. It's enticing and colorful and shiny, and a quick first layer of, I got it. But if you give it a minute, give it a second or third viewing, there are undercurrents of layers and tensions specifically constructed into each image, both singularly as well as supplanted throughout the entire project, that allow for slow revelations of meaning, depth, cultural references, in order to produce impact, highlight societal conflicts, and good old-fashioned storytelling. That what is immediately revealed is not always what is being said, and/or is not what the only thing being said or asked of the viewer to contemplate. Before I shove off to the next project, let's look at one last image. Might be my favorite one. Titling borrowed directly from Edward St. Aubyn's fourth novel of his Patrick Melrose series. I don't know if anyone read that series. You should, it's really, really good. It replicates the complicated relationship he has with his mother perfectly. It's funny, it's dark, it can even be seen as violent, and it's also absurd, but it's compelling, and it makes a statement beyond that the child who's well past breastfeeding age, for the majority of our population to be culturally accepted, again, perception, is wearing makeup and suggestively smoking cigarettes. It's truly ridiculous. So why did I make the image? Because for me, it points directly to power dynamics, about the age-old power dynamics that the cycle of life creates and recreates over and over and over again. It is that the archetypal mother and child, Madonna and child, that ultimately the child who starts off the dependent becomes the caretaker becomes the dependent, repeat, recycle, repeat. This image, additionally, spirals toward any power dynamic within any social construct, and how power is often twisted into something paradoxical, nonsensical, or ridiculous. Essentially, it stands as a metaphor for power and its absurdity and potential danger. So I continue telling stories upon finishing Domestic Bliss and fall into a collaboration with film director Nathan Buck to create a short film inspired by my Domestic Bliss series. It is a story that references violence, but in a quieter way than Domestic Bliss. It uses domesticity as a central through line, but the violence is psychological and more inward, a more self-directed violence, if you will. The cupcake journeys to the inner dialogue of one of the characters who could very easily be an extraction from Domestic Bliss. It takes on a more psychological tone. If you haven't seen it, try to get to it. It's right behind that red wall. As I move to my third project, the overall impression becomes hushed and drops to a deeper level of emotion, mood, and tension. The overarching theme is still there, but the violence is not the verb. It's the subtext. It's the aftermath of centuries of violence, a violence that was silenced and coddled, if you will, a settled depression, simmering resentment, and the slippery slope of resignation, peppered with pushback and bubbling agency. Then He Forgot My Name is cloaked in womanhood, drawing upon revelations of what seems an endless narrative of neglected boundaries, inequalities, injustices, violence, and the fallout that ensues. Let's step back a minute. My original motivation for this project is partially expressed through the title, Then He Forgot My Name. A need to return to my home, to my place of origin, my parents and my hometown. My father was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I felt a deep desire to spend time with him. We were often at odds with each other during my adolescence, and I felt I had an opportunity to rewrite some of the history coming from a wiser frame of mind. Upon one of my earlier trips home, my brother and I visited his old building that he owns in downtown Youngstown, and he purchased it like 30 years previous. And I'd visited this building several times before, but this time was through the eyes of a photographer. The beauty and the history of the building, it vibrated through the walls, and it was palpable. Fortuitously, the Youngstown Historical Society was located right across the street. So I immediately, after asking my brother if I could use the building, went over there and I gleaned the history of the building from its inception. And after spending some time with this information and allowing for some artistic licensing, I decided that I would do a study on women and the stories they lived throughout the building's history. One of the earlier images I shot, and a very good example of using the history of the building to feed the content of the image, is her story. One of the main building occupants was a tailor company for over 50 years. And an early objective of mine was to use found objects within the building to add to the authenticity and honor the history of the space. The sewing machine was left within the building, as well as the old light bulb. And so I theorized this tailor employed many women. I also speculate that the years of toil, as well as dreaming of something new, were lived throughout these rooms and walls. And I can still imagine presently women across the globe dreaming of a different existence. On this project, I worked entirely solo. I produced, I directed, I modeled, hair, makeup, I did post-processing, I did my own printing. I was my one-person crew. This image, private, always begins the narrative for me. Although it was shot 2 years into the project, it literally and metaphorically invites the audience into the stories of private thoughts, private lives, private moments, private reflections. It sets the stage for the entire project. This is also a great example of constructed femininities that is a through line of the trilogy. There is undoubtedly a study of female sensuality, and at times I use it as a sex sells, replicating the cultural exploitation of the female body we are all inundated with, but I pull it to a deeper, more complicated reveal, not to sell products, but to bask in the complexities of our stories, of our darkness, that the fallout of this exploitation inadvertently nurtures, to reclaim the feminine in all its strength, grief, beauty, and will. On a more technical note, I was very interested in working with color and lighting throughout this exploration. This image introduces the color palette of red, white, and blue, with accents of yellow that are suggested throughout the series. The color palette of red, white, and blue was a slow unearthing throughout the project. I did not consciously begin this project with this intent. Rather, about 2.5 years in, I stepped back and evaluated all my images and began to see a repetitive pattern of this color palette, which happened to coincide with the 2016 presidential race, which is why I believe the red, white, and blue seeped into my images subconsciously. And a sublime example of this is The Fall, Red. A beautifully dressed, elegant woman falling down the staircase dressed in red, symbolizing power or danger. Metaphorically, I view this image through the history of women who have gotten too close to power and success and tumbled or were pushed back, where they were believed to belong by some, by many, or culturally. Right at this moment in history, when this image was shot, Hillary Clinton lost her bid for presidency to be the first female president of the United States. And I can and simultaneously find it difficult to believe we still have not had this glass ceiling shattered. Anyway, I took her loss very personally. This image was my direct reaction. Looking beyond the personal and the political references, because of the content of the image or of the representational outcome, it invites us to question or visualize what happened before, and you can easily imagine her a few moments before ascending the old but elegant staircase in her beautiful ball gown, full makeup and hair, all the trappings of success or societal climbings or stereotypical female embellishments. And when she almost reaches the top, she falls or gets pushed down. Essentially, you can decide if she fell to the pressures of her self-described trappings, pushed down by her cultural repressions, or someone or thing uncomfortable with her progress and success. This project is intentionally layered. This is how I work. I tell layered, multidimensional stories. It's how I experience life, always complex, never simple. I am looking for inspiration from history to present stories. And I have revealed thus far different techniques or processes I've used. I've spoken about color as symbol, image content, found objects on set, inspiration or reaction to current events, research, all in order to tell a better story within a single image. And it shouldn't matter if the audience gets these layers, but they should be felt. You must create your own story or outcome, but I'll reveal a bit of what I was thinking and inspired by when building out the image bullet hole. I categorize it as a found object, or in this case, a found occurrence on set. It is an actual bullet hole within an interior glass wall of the building. For me, it tells the story of Youngstown, Ohio, or any forgotten Rust Belt city, or forgotten people for that matter, and those that live there, and the crime that thrives in economically neglected communities, and how crime affects individual people, especially women. My life was touched by violence when I was 14 years old, when my favorite cousin was murdered in his childhood home a few towns away from me. Violence, all types of violence, domestic, gun, sexual, have a lasting effect, and they reverberate out, sometimes for generations. I know the story of gun violence, and I know it is one of the reasons why guns are always found in my work. And it's a way of processing what happened many decades ago within my family. In essence, this image, in its physical layers, replicates or represents the multi-layers of human experience. A past event affects a current event or story, which in turn influences a mood or action. This image successfully teeters between protection from and defense of. And I see it as a metaphor for the defense of the female body, personal privacy, survival, defense of society, of one's own mortality, of one's own psychology, and or the protection from others, or decay of spirit, decay of one's own mind, decay of society or social mores, etc. Simultaneously, the building and its state of deterioration is also telling its own parallel stories of decay, endurance, and fortitude, which is analogous to our own fate as living beings. I always date my work. I want the audience to know and be curious about what is historically going on during the date of creation, which may give you insight or meaning, as well as relating the image to current events. For example, I created this during 2017, and for me, during this era, was the first time democracy was feeling insecure in my lifetime. I never questioned its existence. I felt it would always be there. And what would our future look like if that happened, as well as the introduction of Me Too era. Both of these realities were in my consciousness. It makes sense that this image beautifully represents the contradiction of the times. And right now, 2023, for me, it could read as women protecting her reproductive rights, as well as defending her body on any given day. Ozymandias. It was inspired by the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. And if you don't know it, you'll have to go and find it on the internet. This poem reflects the transitory nature of everything: life, legacy, power, and government. I use symbols, color, and composition to present a modern play on these timeless words. And to take one step further, I see this image and poem as representational to the modern day events of our reality. The bare legs of a woman are once again utilized to allure and entice, evoking familiar imagery, as well as symbolize the statues referenced in the poem. A red telephone serves as a symbol representing the emergency line of communication for perhaps apocalyptic scenarios or the disintegration of one's surroundings. The peeling wall, resembling a global map, hints at the possible decline of American global dominance, or the decline of American global dominance, the erosion of democracy as a viable system, or the deterioration of what is commonly known as truth. All these elements converge, suggesting a harboring or an allaying of personal fears in response to the escalating current events and the eruption of deeply rooted anxieties. The creation of Levitas. It was a physically demanding process. This particular shot required me to grab onto a pipe within a trap door above the toilet, and I was hoisting myself up while keeping my feet relaxed and centered over the toilet. It was challenging and really fun. The shot took place in late fall, and the building lacked heat and running water and had electricity only on 2 floors. I had lots of extension cords running up and down steps and through ceilings to gain access to electricity. In the construction of this image, the woman is depicted as both hanging and/or flying, depending on the viewer's interpretation, symbolizing her escape from societal expectations and pressures through either self-violence or pure magic. I intentionally used the color yellow, and the swish of the dress, you can see there's like movement, to symbolize a fresh start and a magical lifting away, reminiscent of the iconic Mary Poppins. And the presence of spilled cleanser references domesticity once again, a through line from Domestic Bliss. So through the motion and the color choice of the dress and the title, Levitas, I aim to convey a sense of lightness and a new beginning. However, the almost subliminal suggestion of hanging introduces a crack in the flow of interpretation, adding tension and prompting questions of truth. The conflicting presentations I've employed throughout this trilogy highlight the power of perception and the lens through which we view the world. The uninvited. The conversation of immigrants, for me, comes to mind when creating this image, and how our immigrants of yesterday created our nation and fueled our mills and industry. The conversation continues today, and the feelings of not belonging, but longing to be invited. But of course, it can also be taken on a more personal, private level of one's own psychology and existentialism of not belonging anywhere, and that eternal search for home and belonging and ultimately meaning. So the VW bus was a perfectly found object to create character and backstory. I imagine this character in the throes of personal change and development and symbolically running over her past, essentially killing parts of herself or her identity to make room for a new future. I recycled the yellow dress from the cupcake, so intentionally pulling a visual through line from one project to the next. And I love the idea of a larger theme pulsating throughout. The rope in the corner is also a theme throughout the project, symbolizing the duality of what a rope is used for both saving a life and taking a life, for playing as well as the antithesis of playing, for suppressing movement or freedoms. This was shot on the second floor, obscurus. It's in a closet in the rear of the building, and a closeted anonymous woman obscured by her surroundings and feminine trappings, a broken window symbolizing a way of thinking, an action, a disruption. I worked on this image for a couple years, and I first saw the broken window and the closet right when I started, but I kind of just put it in my mind's eye, and I just let it sit for a couple years. And I started to play with the closet and window like 2 years in, and just started thinking of closet and windows as symbols for hiding something away and for revealing and starting afresh or new ideas. And I love that the broken window, it was already broken, and I used the broken glass on the floor from another window in the building that broke earlier that year from a big windstorm. So it's a good example of crafting and the images that I would find on set. I sat for this image a year previous and decided to come back to it and redo it as it just didn't have enough impact. And I do that a lot. Like, I'll let things sit, I'll sit and study and decide, you know what, no, I need to go back, it's not perfect enough. And I did that with Domestic Bliss many, many times, and I did that with Then He Forgot My Name. I was just never, I always was searching for that perfection. And so it didn't matter how much I had to work. So I'll end with this last image. The use of the color palette, red, white, and blue, in conjunction with the deteriorating state of the room both implies and explores the tenuous nature of power, while flashes of yellow representing the light of new beginnings and potential for rebirth. A naked, strong woman rising to the top edge of the frame to begin again or rise above. She's removed what little costume, mask remains and ascends on her own accord. Despite it all, amid the ruins, the strength of the woman emerges. So within all the images and stories live a plethora of women with contradictions abound. Some still victims of their stories, some still struggling for their own agency, and some having claimed their contradictions, imperfections, and ultimately their strength. To then seeing past this literal meaning and to soften the focus and allow for metaphoric and analogous expression of cultural, political, societal struggles or events in order to continue the conversation and progress. Blow dryer, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. I'm so glad you brought that up because I meditated on those women while I created that. Because I can, when they were in the press, I was like, they were just so vilified. And I mean, yeah, they did the worst thing possible. But I think we all can understand. And then, our authority not understanding mental illness and just being like, man, I don't know if she belongs in jail, and just, and just how the press is just so flat, right? You don't get the whole story and understanding and complexities, right? And the husband, I mean, I remember that story, like, he seemed to be the person he was pushing her to always have children, and she kept talking about how I don't want any more, I can't handle this. And then he went off and he got married again. Yeah. Yeah, so yes, I totally meditated on all those women. I remember writing about that and just naming a list of them who had done the worst, right? They succumbed, yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, with domestic bliss, I did a lot of storyboarding. Like, it would almost be like I always worked with the idiom, right? So then I wanted to kind of like prove that idiom in some way. Either it was the emotional side of the idiom or it was, just kind of a literal version. And then what I did was I always thought, how can I twist it into the darkness? And so then I would pull in the twist. And I would always visualize how it would be composed. So I did. I'm not very good at drawing, so it was like little stick figures. And it pretty much stayed as when I got that image. It pretty much stayed in the composition of it. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Oh yes. Oh yes. I'll tell you a little bit about that, especially with domestic bliss because it was in my home. And I had young kids, and so I would set a scene up, and I think it was because I was hopeful, like, oh, I got it. I mean, 700 images, I've got to have gotten it. And then I was so hopeful, and I'd strike the set, and then I'd look at the images, and I'm like, I didn't get it. And it was maybe just not the right look in one of the characters' faces, or maybe a hand, or just an angle. And I was like, all right, I got to go back. And I have to set it up again. And some of them were 3 times. I think that was the most, 3 times. But it really taught me about just going for it. Like, don't just accept. Go for this. We're going for this. If you're going to do this, do it right. And I worked through that, I guess, that laziness that, we all come up against, right? Yeah. And also this, too, because I was traveling to Youngstown, Ohio from upstate New York, and I would travel all the way across Pennsylvania with my equipment, and I would stay there for about 2 or 3 weeks at a time, probably about 5 or 6 times a year. And again, hopeful. I was like, I think I got it. And then I'd go home, and I'd look at all my work, and I'm like, no, got to reset it, set it up again. And then I also worked with, I know I don't have it, but I'm going to set something up. I have an idea, and let me see if I can just like sleep on it a little bit over the next month that I'm not there and I'm just at home parenting. So, yeah. Yes? Let me take a drink first. So, thank you, Jennifer, for that. Yeah, so when I did Domestic Bliss, I had a solo show in New York City, and when it was opening, someone called me up, one of the online editors, I don't remember what it was, called me up and did an interview, and I was green. I was just talking away, and I had no real theory composed yet, and when they put the images out online, it went viral. And then about a week later, within that, I had inundating people coming. I felt like coming into my home because it was through the internet for the next 2 years, wanting interviews and asking for my time. And it was actually frightening. I was frightened. I wasn't excited. It freaked me out. But on top of it, about a week after my solo show opened, what is it called? Not the authorities. Who are they? Protective Services called me. The authorities called me, and that killed me. I was stressed. I was scared, and thankfully, my agent, or the guy, the social service guy, called me, and he was like this wonderfully Latin gay guy. He's like, I'm gay, I'm Latin, don't worry. I've looked at your work, I see what it is. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And he's like, I know I'm gonna come into your house and it's gonna be lovely and it's all gonna be, done and erased. But it didn't matter because it planted a seed. And I have to say, I don't know, like I look at Sally Mann and I'm like, she was so strong through that. And I didn't feel strong through it. I felt defensive, and I felt even like my parenting style changed. Like I felt like I couldn't be as strong with my kids. Like I felt like I was like giving into. It was crazy. Like it's crazy. And so it took me about 2 or 3 years to kind of overcome that. And finally, I started seeing a therapist because I felt like I just couldn't create or anything. And he's like, look at it this way, you were anointed. I'm like, okay, great. But yeah, I don't know. Makes me irritated just because I see that it's just the misogyny in our culture. Keep the woman down if she's doing something and creative and powerful. And it just frustrates me. But anyway, I survived, and then I went on to create some more work, so that was good. I'm working. I'm just not convinced yet. Yeah, like I'm always working, but nothing has... for me, my work has to be personal, and it has to really come from somewhere. And it hasn't yet. So I keep working. I get technically better, but who cares? Honestly, I want to make work that impacts people. I want to make work that people go to a museum and they feel something. And that's what I want to do. So it takes time. It takes time. And it can be frustrating. But I always know when I'm onto something. I don't feel like I'm onto anything. I'll just be honest. I'm kind of just living right now, working, but yeah. Something will come. Something will hit me. Yeah, they don't talk about it a lot. They really don't. I'm still waiting for them to, I don't know, have a reaction. Actually, I read my talk to my daughter, who's going to be a junior in college. And she's now a stand-up comic. And so she's in like the living arts, and when I read it to her, she said, wow, I really get it now. I don't think I understood your art, and I think maybe at times she was seeing that I was trying to kill her, and so maybe she's like, what's that? So she really appreciated it on a whole different level. Yeah. And even my daughter, who's a senior this year, I read it to her, and she's like, oh, that's awesome. So, yeah, I think they had fun. But I don't really want NPR to, interview them. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, it was my intent, definitely. When dealing with that dark underbelly of life yeah, it's based around a woman, but men can totally relate to all of it as well. It's, so many people. I have people from all over the world who write to me and say, oh my gosh, I can, like a guy from India, it's like, I can totally relate. It's so cute. He's like, I don't even have kids, but I can totally relate. So, it was intentional, and I really, it's hard to be funny in that image, and so I wanted to prove to myself that I could do that, and I did. I don't know how I did it now. Now I'm far away from it. I'm like, wow, that was kind of just, the light shining on me. Not quite how. Yes. Yeah. Huh. No, I love to just go in there. I love darkness, like Ozark. I love that show. I've watched it 4 times through. I go there. It's my perspective. It's what I do. Like, I like to toil in that place. Yeah, actually. So after that intensity from domestic bliss, I feel like I was like, wow, I really put myself out there. That was a lot of energy, and what did I create? And so I feel like I got a little conservative with my next project. You know, I mean, how could it not affect one? You know, so I started thinking more technically and more, you know, what can I do to make it pop? But maybe I didn't want to go back there. But it doesn't need to go back there. I did it. You know, like, it's out there. It's done. I did it. And I don't want to replicate it, right? So, yeah. But yeah, and if you watch the movie, it's also dark. It's psychological and dark. And did a lot of you get to see the movie? Yeah. It's a little cupcake of a movie. Yeah. Oh. Someone back there? Okay. Anyone? Anything else? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I definitely do it on purpose, because, I mean, it's like my kids say, oh, when I go to a museum, I'm bored. And I want to I want to entice people to come in and look. So I use bright colors, and I use that sex appeal, and I use all of those tools that media uses constantly. But then I'm not just telling a flat story. I'm telling the underbelly of humanity, right? Like, our emotions are deep, dark, dirty emotions, right? And so that juxtaposition, I think I got the balance of it, right? Like, I want to pull people in. I want to pull people into museums because I think art changes people's lives, right? And so maybe someone else is creating a very powerful piece, but no one's going to go see it because it's not. So maybe this will draw them in, and then they can relate, and then they go next door and see that next piece that, you know, isn't quite as visually stimulating, right? But I also grew up in the 80s, so it speaks to me too, right? Like, I like that stuff. I like a magazine. I like movies. I mean, but I always wanted, even when I was a kid, like, watching television, I was like, what is this? These characters aren't changing. I mean, it's happening now, obviously, but back in the 80s and 90s, it was just lame, early 2000s. Yeah. So, you know, just like my upbringing definitely helped me create this, right? Everything, all of it. And I'm attracted to all of that, right? But then I want something said, right? Yeah. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. You know, I think my favorite from Domestic Bliss is Mother's Milk. I think it's sublime. It just hits. I'll tell you a story. It was like my third piece that I created from that series, and I was still taking classes at ICP and still trying to be like, is this okay that I'm creating this? I don't know. What am I doing here? And one of the TAs in my class looks at it, and she said, well, this is perfect. I don't know how you move on from here. And I was like, oh my God. I'm like, great, I don't either. And I literally did not make another image for a year. It really ruined me. I was like, oh shit, I don't know. So yeah, but then I went on. I was like, forget her. I'm just gonna go back to the idiom and just kind of working the process. Yeah. Yes. Back.
So she told him this Zen story about a king who had commissioned an artist to do him a piece of work. And so 5 years went by, and he sent the messenger back and the accountant back to get the painting. So the guy said, oh yeah, here it is. So he threw it off real fast and handed it to him. The guy said, are you kidding me? You're going to give me this piece of crap after we've waited for 5 years? He said, yeah, but I've been thinking about it the whole time.
Yeah.
It's part of it. I mean, that's
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely. And you have to just kind of keep creating and get through. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if there are enough pieces of work. A book has to be substantial, and I just don't, I'm not convinced yet that there are enough. But I don't know. And I don't know. Do we need more art books? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, people ask me that, but I'm still not convinced. I want people to see it. I want people in museums. I think that's my purpose. I want people to go and visit. Get in there. I don't know if enough people go to the museums, like go. I mean, that new generation, and maybe that's what I want to speak to, that new generation who's on their phones a lot. So, I don't know. I don't know about a book. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I worked a long time on it. I really wanted to kind of crack the code on this whole exhibit, and especially domestic bliss, because I was really green when it came out, and I didn't quite know what I had created yet. I know what my intentions were, et cetera, but I just didn't know how to, the language. So I really just kind of sat down by myself for several weeks and just kind of cracked it. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here so that I could crack that code. And I love it. I love the space. It's perfect. Actually, I came here this morning before the museum opened, and I got teary because it's beautiful. It's really beautiful to see it come to life. So, yeah, I thank you so much for coming out. Really, really appreciate it. Nice response. Yeah.